Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about foreign policy and world affairs. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. And in this show, we discuss topical global issues, have conversations with foreign affairs thought leaders and newsmakers, and give you the context you need to understand the world today. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com to learn more. And now on with the show. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi was re-elected to office in May in what was a landslide victory for his BJP party. Modi is a Hindu nationalist in a diverse country that includes one of the world's largest Muslim populations. He rose to political prominence in the early 2000s as the chief minister of Gujarat during inter-communal riots that led to the murder of over 1,000 people, mostly Muslims. He was widely accused of failing to stop the riots and has used the mass murder of Muslims in Gujarat in 2002 to his political advantage. Modi was first elected prime minister in 2014, and since his re-election in May 2019, Modi has very much doubled down on implementing a stridently pro-Hindu agenda that is undermining secular democracy in India. This includes most recently the passage of a law that excludes Muslim immigrants to India of certain citizenship eligibilities. That transparently anti-Muslim law has sparked massive protests across India, which at the time of recording show little signs of abating. On the line with me to explain how a newly re-elected Narendra Modi is using his political power to advance a Hindu nationalist agenda and what that means in a country with nearly 200 million Muslims is Michael Kugelman. He is Deputy Director of the Asia Program and a South Asia Senior Associate at the Wilson Center. We kick off discussing this new citizenship law before having a broader conversation about how Narendra Modi is changing India, what that means for Indian democracy and international relations. And I should note, during this conversation, Michael Kugelman references an article in The New Yorker by Dexter Filkins. This is a masterful piece of journalism that explains some of the roots of Narendra Modi's Hindu nationalism. I'll post a link to it on globaldispatchespodcast.com. If you are new to the show, welcome. Please subscribe to the podcast feed wherever you are listening to this. When you do, you will unlock hundreds of episodes that give in-depth treatment to topics that don't typically receive that kind of nuance and in-depth discussion from around the world. And if you're a regular listener, please do feel free to send me an email. You can do so using the contact button on globaldispatchespodcast.com. And today's episode is brought to you by Northwestern University's online master's program in global health. You can learn how to make a meaningful difference in places where it's needed the most. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com and click on the ad to learn more, or go to sps.northwestern.edu/global. And now here is my conversation with Michael Kugelman of the Wilson Center.
So this is a law that essentially allows immigrants from three countries neighboring India, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, to apply for citizenship in India on a fast-track basis. And it applies to immigrants of just about every religion out there except for one, and that is Islam. So in effect, if you are a Muslim migrant from one of those countries, Afghanistan, Pakistan, or Bangladesh, then you are not eligible to apply for citizenship under this law. So, on the one hand, initially it sounds like a really good thing. You're trying to provide citizenship for religious minorities that have been persecuted in the countries that they are originally from. But then when you look at this more broadly and realize that it doesn't apply to Muslims, who in many cases are being persecuted where they are. For instance, if you're talking about a Shia Muslim in Pakistan, for example, or a Rohingya Muslim who's come from Bangladesh. These are people that have been persecuted as well. And so the reason why this law is so controversial is that it appears to explicitly discriminate along religious lines, which is not allowed per the Indian constitution, which says that there can't be any discrimination on religious grounds. India being a secular democracy.
Well, a secular democracy, though it's probably fair to say that this latest law is yet another example of Narendra Modi and his ruling party chipping away at that secular identity of India.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. I would argue, and I think many others would argue that the Modi government is really marching toward an end goal of having India become a Hindu state, which again is the very opposite of what India was intended to be. And this notion of India becoming a Hindu state really, I think, goes against the very notion, or it goes against the very bedrock principles that have defined the Indian political system since its inception. And by that, I'm talking about ideals like secularism, religious pluralism. But you are right. I mean, what we've seen over the last few years is a series of new laws and developments, which we could certainly go into, that all have this same sort of pattern, which is to really elevate the status of Hindus in state and society, and in the process marginalize what is a very large Muslim minority in India. There are about 180, 200 million Muslims in India right
now. Which, makes it the single largest Muslim country outside of like Indonesia, maybe?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we're talking about, a religious minority that it's really akin to the total population of Pakistan, for example. So indeed, as you suggest, this is a very sizable minority.
And so, I know we're speaking about fast-moving events, but can you describe the reaction so far to the passage of that law in India?
Yeah, so the reaction has been very striking in that there's been a lot of people with different types of political views in India that have come out in opposition. So on the one hand, and as you know, there were a number of protests which sometimes turned violent last weekend. And on the one hand, you have some Indian Muslims who have come out in protest because they fear this means that India is, as we've discussed, marching in a direction that's going to make Muslims feel more marginalized than they already do. And so, you have a lot of members of the Muslim community who are very unhappy and very worried. But the interesting thing is that you also have members of the Indian Hindu majority, particularly those that are particularly conservative and nationalist, who worry that this new citizenship law will encourage more immigration on the whole by essentially saying, well, look, if you're a persecuted Hindu minority or a persecuted some type of minority that's being persecuted in some other country, you're going to see this as a big opportunity to come to India where you'll be safe and you can get citizenship. And, for members of these conservative nationalist Indian Hindus, they don't want more immigration, sort of shades of the types of debates we're having about immigration in a lot of other countries too. So there's been that type of opposition to this new law. And then you also have a different type of opposition from those that just believe that this new law is really embodying this very troubling trend of India running roughshod over these revered and cherished principles of secularism and religious pluralism. So you've got a critical mass of people in India that are really concerned. They're opposed to this law on very visceral levels, even if they come from very different political points of view.
So you said earlier that this law apparently seems to contravene India's constitution. Do you see there being a kind of a Supreme Court test case emerging in the coming future that could potentially invalidate this law?
Yes, I mean, as I understand it, there already are. There's already a movement in process to have some type of challenge at the Indian Supreme Court, and I think I mean, it's hard to predict what will happen. I mean, my gut feeling, just based on where the direction that the country has been going in, the current zeitgeist in the country, I would be surprised if the Supreme Court does not uphold this law. And, if the Supreme Court does rule in the favor of the government and says that, this law is constitutional, that it can go ahead, and in that sense, if the law truly becomes the law of the land in India, I think that could provide a spark for fresh protests and more unrest in the streets, especially if people realize that this is for real. You're going to have to live with the consequences of this law. That would really, I think, galvanize a lot of people on the streets.
So this law is seemingly the latest in a series of steps that Modi and his government have taken since re-election last spring. The elections were, in May, and the BJP, which is Modi's party, won overwhelmingly. Mm-hmm. Can you discuss, for example, like the various incarnations of this kind of nationalist ideology and how they've been applied since May?
Sure. I would identify three particular examples that sort of exemplify this way in which the Modi government in its second term is aggressively pursuing this Hindu nationalist agenda. The first one, as you mentioned, was the Article 370 revocation, which is essentially when the Indian government decided to revoke the special status, which was an autonomous status for the region of Jammu and Kashmir, which is the Indian administered part of Kashmir. That's the only Muslim majority state or region in India. And there are many critics of Modi and his government that believe that one reason why the government decided to revoke Kashmir's autonomy is that by doing that, by incorporating it into India as a union territory, in other words, by making it a formal part of the country, it becomes a lot easier for people from outside this Muslim majority region to come in, to invest, to acquire land, and to live there. So there's a fear that the government wants to alter the demographics of Jammu and Kashmir by essentially bringing in more investors and people who are Hindus, Indian Hindus, so that eventually you could dilute the identity of this region, which again is Muslim majority. So that's why I would describe this case of the Article 370 repeal as an example of this Hindu nationalist strategy, in effect, to really make it easier for Indian Hindus to be in Jammu and Kashmir, even though this is a Muslim majority region. Second example was a Supreme Court case some time ago, a very controversial one that really was, came down to issues about whether there was a former Hindu temple that had been present in a particular area, whether it should be rebuilt or not. It's been bandied about for many years. The Supreme Court had not weighed in, but at this point it did, and it said that the Indian government is now permitted to build a Hindu temple on this area that many Muslims think had once been the site of a Muslim facility. So now, of course, this is the Supreme Court. This is not the government, but it is interesting that the Supreme Court weighs in at this very time when you have Modi 2.0 just having relatively returned to power. And then the third example to highlight is something the Indian government has instituted, what is described as a new registry of citizens in the state of Assam, which is a very impoverished, underdeveloped part of India in the northeast. The idea here was to start this registry, a list of Indian citizens. And the way that it was done to work was to have people present evidence that their ancestors or their family had been in India since 1971. And if they could present documents to indicate that, they would be considered citizens. I think what the idea here in Assam, which is a state that is controlled by the ruling BJP party, the idea was to weed out illegal immigrants, mainly Muslim from Bengali immigrants from Bangladesh.
And it's worth maybe pointing out that Assam, if people can sort of picture a map of India in their mind, is that far easternmost province or state that's kind of that surrounds sort of Bangladesh and Myanmar and Bhutan and to the north, that little sort of peninsula of India.
Exactly, yeah. So it's a very strategic area, so to speak. But at any rate, the idea with this registry was to make it easier to oblige Muslim migrants in this state to to get out. And what the
But if you can't prove your citizenship, if you don't have documentation, you are
exactly.
potentially rendered
Yeah,
stateless.
that's the idea. And what the Indian government wants to do eventually is to nationalize this registry of citizens and take it beyond Assam across the entire country. And that has a lot of people worried as well.
Well, and potentially use that as a pretext to render populations stateless.
Exactly right. No, and I think it's important to look at the citizenship law, the new citizenship law, and this registry in the same light, because I think in both cases the idea is to try to quite frankly, make it more difficult for Muslim migrants to stay in the country. And I should say that it was actually the Assam registry experiment backfired from the perspective of the Indian government, because what they ended up finding out was that a significant number of the people of people that couldn't find their documents and couldn't be listed as citizens, they were actually Hindus. And that's, I think, has sort of given the Indian government an extra incentive to push out the citizenship law, which again makes it easier for Hindu migrants to get citizenship. So it's almost like a way to answer back and not reciprocate, but I should say compensate for the fact that a number of these Hindus in India were disadvantaged by the what happened with the registry, and make it easier for them to get citizenship through this new citizenship law.
So can you briefly take us back in the political history of Narendra Modi to, say, Gujarat, where he was what's the functional equivalent of the governor of Gujarat during the riots, the 2002 Gujarat intercommunal violence riots, which saw over 1,000 mostly Muslim people killed, and some would say, and some have accused Modi of facilitating those riots, or at least not using the power of the government to stop them. And for that, he was for a long time denied visas to go to Europe or the United States because of his supposed complicity in those intercommunal riots. But it seems that Hindu nationalism and anti-Muslim sentiment has fueled his rise in politics since the early parts of his career. Can you describe what happened in Gujarat and how what has happened then is sort of influencing and very much defining his agenda today?
Yeah, sure. And actually, very briefly before we even hit on the Gujarat riots, I think that Narendra Modi is someone that has always used Hindu nationalism as a calling card, and it goes way back to his very young days. I mean, this is someone that came up as a very avid, fervent member of the RSS, which is a virulently ideologically conservative and even extremist organization that has close ties to the BJP, to the ruling party. And Modi was a member from a very young age, and the RSS is, for all intents and purposes, an extremist organization that promotes virulent forms of Hindu nationalism. But anyway, getting to the Gujarat riots, I mean, this was a case where Modi was the chief minister of the state of Gujarat, as you noted before, is basically like being governor of the state. And he was indeed accused of not being the guy that was out there in the streets lighting the fires and firing the weapons, but the guy that refused to intervene, that even when he was told really, really bad and things were happening, people were getting killed, he was accused of basically just shrugging his shoulders and letting it go. And there's a great essay in the New Yorker that came out several weeks ago by Dexter Filkins that really takes us through this, what happened. And so those were the main allegations against Modi, that he basically did not do enough to stop what happened. And as you noted, much of the world seemed to think those allegations were true. And as you noted, there were several key capitals, including Washington, that didn't necessarily have a formal visa ban, but they basically said that they would hold him to this law here in the U.S. that bans foreign leaders from coming to the United States if they've been implicated in serious or egregious violations of religious freedom. And the EU also made it very difficult. They didn't let him come into their countries as well. But the interesting thing is that the Indian Supreme Court did rule that there was no compelling evidence to convict him for the allegations, even though A lot of people still think it's true. But anyway, since then, he rose to the top. He became prime minister. And it's true that he used Hindu nationalism as obviously one of his big platforms, but he's also tried to sort of pitch himself as a free marketer, as a reformer, as someone that really wants to liberalize everything. And he was actually very successful in that regard, in engaging in a number of liberalization reforms in Gujarat to, at least on some measures, strengthen the economy there. But and when he was first elected in 2014, the first time he became prime minister, he was really elected on a mandate to strengthen the Indian economy. That was one of the major platforms that he was running on back in that election. But he didn't do very well in that effort to try to push through a number of sort of so-called second-generation reforms needed to strengthen India's economy and put it in a better position to keep globally. And it's interesting that after the first few years of his term, things started to change a bit. I think he saw the writing on the wall. He recognized that the economic reform plan was not going well. There was all these headlines about unemployment problems, a slowing manufacturing sector. And it's at that point when he really started to push the Hindu nationalist agenda. And you saw that echoed and amplified on the campaign trail in 2018. 2019, sorry. And then he's really pushed that through during the first few months of his last term. So I think it's almost like he recognized that his he was experiencing political vulnerability because of his inability to make progress on the economic side. Recognizing that vulnerability, he realized that it was time to push the social agenda, believing that would sort of insulate him from the political disadvantages he could face in struggling with the economy. And I think that worked for a while,
And is it sort of fair to say that this, terrorist attack in Kashmir in February, which killed 40 soldiers, provided him with the pretext he needed to really hammer home that kind of nationalist agenda and, launched this kind of almost like fake war in Pakistan? That was around the time I think you and I spoke last. You kind of that sort of attack gave him the pretext he needed to, as you said, hammer home on these kind of nationalist themes, and that sort of changed the trajectory of the election, which was only a few months after that.
Yes, I mean you're right. I mean the attack on Indian security forces, which India blamed on Pakistan, even though it wasn't particularly clear that Pakistan had a direct role in it, that did, I think, give his campaign new energy. Though I would argue that he was already coming down pretty harshly on Pakistan. I mean, rhetorically, there'd been a lot of harsh anti-Pakistan rhetoric in the months leading up to that incident. I mean, you had his government very publicly calling out any opponents of the Indian government as anti-national and literally saying you should go to Pakistan, which is sort of like insulting them in that regard. And the BJP didn't really have a strong opponent in the election campaign. The Congress, the opposition party, the Congress, really wasn't doing a good job with the campaign. But you're right, that certainly did help. I mean, that attack on Indian forces, it sort of allowed Modi to come out with this really strong rally around the flag type mentality. And, if there's one thing that'll get people united in India, it's anger at Pakistan. And that's what happened, that it catapulted him to the top. But, I should say that, Modi's view had been that by pushing the social agenda, that'll make people forget about the economic constraints, and people would support the social agenda because, the most people in India would support it. It's a big gamble. It did work for a while when he made when he revoked the autonomy of Kashmir. That was extremely popular across the board, even among many Indian Muslims. But it's now with the citizenship law where things have changed a bit because you actually do have significant opposition to it.
So, it seems clear based on what you've described that Modi's attempts to chip away at the secular foundation of Indian, democracy can have, profoundly destabilizing domestic political effects. What sort of international consequences do you see towards resulting from this Hindu nationalist agenda?
Yeah, I would break down the international implications to regional within South Asia and then more broadly in a global sense. In terms of the regional implications, it's very striking that some of India's closest friends in Asia, in South Asia and Asia, were very unhappy about this decision. Bangladesh, which is probably India's closest partner in South Asia, was very unhappy and very worried because it feels that all of these Bengali Muslim migrants that had come into India from Bangladesh are going to be kicked out of India, and they're all going to pour back into Bangladesh, and that's not what Bangladesh wants. And then you had a country like Afghanistan, which is also very close to India. The government in Kabul was very upset because it didn't like being told by India that Afghanistan is a country where religious minorities are persecuted. It didn't make the Afghan government look good. So, several senior Bangladeshi officials canceled visits to India soon after this decision was made. And then you had the Japanese Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, who was planning a summit. He was going to meet with Narendra Modi in Assam. He had to cancel his trip for safety reasons, so that doesn't look good. So I think for Narendra Modi, improving relations with India's neighbors, not just Pakistan, but the broader region, has always been a major foreign policy objective for him. But this citizenship law has really dealt a blow to that. And in terms of the broader, the more global implications, well, I think you have to look at India's image, which has always been fairly pristine until the last few years. But there's having these images come out of these violent protests and Indian police literally beating up and bludgeoning female Muslim university students in New Delhi, that doesn't play well. That is not the India that the Indian government wants the world to see, particularly given the importance that the Indian government has placed in attracting more foreign investment to help stabilize its economy. It's been looking for investors to come in and help things out. They've been trying to get investors, the biggest the manufacturing companies in the world to come in and work alongside Indian manufacturers to try to strengthen the manufacturing industry. It's a program known as Make in India. So, what's happening, the unrest, and I think that the threat that the communal tensions could really explode if current trends continue. That doesn't play well for India's image, and it certainly, I think, could give foreign investors pause. Investors who already are a bit weary about investing in India because of all the red tape and all that other stuff as well. So pretty significant regional and broader international implications for India's government coming out of this domestic legislation here.
Well, I mean, do you think then Modi overstepped? I mean, having secured this massive electoral victory in May, and having, seen that his path to victory was advancing a Hindu nationalist agenda, he's suddenly advancing it very aggressively. I mean, has he overstepped?
Yeah, and this is a debate that we're hearing a lot about. Did he go too far this time? I mean, certainly, I think that alarm bells should be going off across the government when you see the extent of the opposition to this law, and particularly given that you've got members of the BJP rank and file, members of the conservative Hindu nationalists that are out there decrying this law because they think it'll invite more immigration into India. That's a concern, but I don't think we should overstate the problems for Modi here. I mean, certainly he's going to be under a lot of pressure now, but he still remains by far the most popular leader in India, by far, and he still has much of the population behind him. And so, I would sort of push back against those that have been saying in recent days that we could be seeing the beginnings of some type of mass anti-government movement in India to rival the Arab Spring movements in the past and some of these protests we've seen in places like Iraq and Hong Kong more recently. I wouldn't go there because, much of the country is still behind Modi, and much of the country is still behind the citizenship law as well. So, I think it may be premature to say that he overstepped his bounds, but I think the what's next question becomes key here. If he keeps trying to push this social agenda and he doesn't try to make efforts to reconcile and build bridges with the Muslim community and all that, and if there's more unrest, and if he continues to struggle to fix the economy, I think that's the big question. Then you can get to a point where his vulnerability could become more stark. And this is someone that, has sort of indicated subtly that he would be happy to remain prime minister for another few decades, because there are no term limits in India when it comes to prime ministers. But I think now, for the first time, perhaps in his 5 years in power, we've gotten to a point where we have to sort of step back and say, well, he's going to have a lot of work to do to ensure that he could be reelected once we get to the next poll.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for your time. This was very helpful.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Michael. And funny enough, I got a request to do an episode on this topic after I had recorded this conversation. So it seems like me and you, the fantastic podcast listening audience, were on somewhat of the same wavelength. Always love when that happens. All right. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.